Hey, what's up guys? This is Brian at Whisper Status 74. Welcome to the community, welcome to the channel. If this is the first time you were seeing me, please consider liking and subscribing. We are real tech for real people. Today's video will be a tech therapy video. It won't be as long as many of those videos, but it'll be why I think Sony does not have HDMI 2.1. My thoughts on it. Is it super important? Does it matter? Should you not purchase Sony displays this year other than the 900H and the Z8H because they don't have HDMI 2.1? Is it important in regards to picture quality? Is it something that has really altered your decision making and making you go with something like the LG CX, which is behind me, even though you much rather go with Sony due to your love of their picture quality and the styling and the settings that they have? Now, the reason I want to cover this isn't quite as simple as Sony doesn't have it, don't buy it. It's a terrible shame they don't have it. Do I think it's important that Sony doesn't have HDMI 2.1? I personally think it is a huge big deal, but for me that's personal. What I mean by that is based on my usage. Anytime that you buy a display, or I hear a lot in the comments, what do you think the best display is? Now, that is completely up to people's opinions and their thoughts and perspective. There isn't one best display out there. Many people will say it's this, or that. We'll use last year as an example. My top three were the A9G, C9, and the Q90R as far as my favorite panels of last year. You could switch those all around. The C9 last year was very popular as it was slightly or a lot cheaper than the Sony A9G, and it offered HDMI 2.1, and the Q90R had that functionality as well. The A9G, in many people's eyes, was a better display, a better looking display. It was a Master Series display, meaning it's calibrated out of the box, has a very refined image. And it's hard to argue that, especially since I have the Sony A9S in-house. Special thank you to Robert and Wendy Zahn of Value Electronics, which lent that display to me before it was released, as well as the Sony 950H. The luxury of having people like Value Electronics lend people like me those displays before launch is I do have a few advantages. One, having them in-house for so long. I've had the 950H for 6 months, 7 months. The A9S, we've had it before it was released. I still have it, and I'm able to keep it kind of as long as I need. So I'm able to see the displays mature through firmware updates, get to really know them and enjoy them. But more importantly, even someone like Robert Zahn, who's been in this industry for so many years, talking directly with Sony engineers, LG engineers, Samsung, he has a very rare insight as to why certain things happen or don't happen. So going back to that, when I first got the Sony 950H, or first saw it, and was one of the first people on YouTube to actually show the display live, was early February of this year, obviously 2020, right before everything went nuts. It might even have been earlier than that I saw it at Value Electronics before I took it home. And the first thing we talked about was the lack of HDMI 2.1. And if you go back to those videos, the unboxings and all of the game mode settings, and even do a review on it, I actually still have it, was all through the comments, no HDMI 2.1. And then when Shane from Spare Change and I went to the Value Electronics one day and the A8H was being released, I was buying my 55-inch CX that day. And Shane and I both stopped at the door and he said, "Why don't you grab that? It's not even released yet." We looked up the specs, and right away what was illustrated was there was no HDMI 2.1. Also, as a person of YouTube, you're like, well, the interest isn't going to be there for that display. Now, when I first spoke to Robert Zahn about the 950H, his simple response from Sony at the time of why we all think Sony doesn't have HDMI 2.1 was simple timing. Now, that's going to sound a little ridiculous, but the fact is, if you think about when the engineering gets going, manufacturing, planning, all the things that have to be in line. So for all of us, the 950G was a display that I had looked at very early in the year. of the year before, 2019, and HDMI 2.1 wasn't that big a conversation. The 950H being so close to it, I imagine that they were designed similarly, a lot of the same, way it was built, planned out. Is it an upgrade? It's a minimal upgrade. That's the one knock I have of the 950H was it's very similar to the 950G. It's a little bit more refined. However, when that display was made, it was all about timing. Meaning if the engineers are talking about designing this, putting it out, especially since they staggered their releases. 950G was released here, the 900H was released here, the A8H was released another time. Having these staggered releases, now part of that was due to what happened with the pandemic. Obviously the A9G successor was canceled. That is moved till CES next year. Things were very much disrupted, but HDMI 2.1, lack of it was planned or not planned much earlier on. Now, that sounds ridiculous to many of us. However, now, if you think of it objectively, or try to think of it in a corporate way, or a way an engineer, or someone who is building these displays, and those are the people that Robert Zahn from Value Electronics has conversations with, as well as his calibrator, Jonathan, talking directly to LG and Sony, mostly what their plans are, what's happening with firmware updates, and what's amazing is if we could sit all of us together and speak to these engineers, I'm sure gaming would be the last thing that is on their mind. Now that sounds ridiculous. Sony, PlayStation, TVs, Sony Films, all these different divisions, you would think they tap each other on the shoulder and say, hey, we have a console coming out. You guys know there's a console coming out. How come you're not going to add HDMI 2.1? A lot of us thought that with HDR, in regards to gaming and Sony and Dolby Vision, and how come they didn't have all these things right away. But I really believe in corporate places and different. I remember NVIDIA a number of years ago with the the 980, GTX 980, GTX 970. There was a marketing, there was something that was a CUDA core, something was less on the 970, because I remember I had it. They did the marketing did not speak to the engineering. They didn't get it right. They misled some people. And then the 970, which is still a great card, they were offering refunds on it because marketing wasn't speaking to engineering. That's within the same division. You're talking about an enormous company not communicating with each other, if I'm just guessing. But more importantly, the importance of what Sony, as a display maker, focusing on filmmakers, accuracy, natural image, shadow detail, elegance, design. What they're thinking about has nothing to do with gaming. Now, for many of us, or many of you, gaming is paramount with displays. It was only a number of years ago where, input lag was something that people were starting to actually talk about. We were still kind of rare buying TVs for gaming. And I think a lot of the industry minds think that way. Like gaming is still an afterthought to many of them. Now, does that sound ridiculous? Maybe. But if you're thinking about everything that goes into building them, testing them, the processing involved with especially something like Sony, where the processing is so important, the upscaling is so important. I mean, just the amount of information and the amount of work and research, I'm sure gaming is an afterthought. They add a game mode, cool, reduce some of the features, speed up input lag, call it a day. For us, it is very different. We've evolved as users. For me, this is the LG CX. This is 77 inches. But in this room, there is a A9S Master Series OLED. There is another CX here at 55 inches. There's a TCL R635 and the Sony 950H. Picture quality wise, in game mode, the Sony for me is the best. The 950H out of the box game mode, same with the A9S, they look amazing. The CX takes a little bit of messing with to get the picture mode and game mode to look great. But a lot of people aren't giving the Sony the time of day simply because it lacks HDMI 2.1. And that is what we see and what we think. Do I think the Sony engineers can be bothered with gaming? I think the answer is no. And I think it's that simple. I think it's that simple of timing. The 950G, 950H was designed earlier, very similar to the 950G. The 900H, which isn't really the successor to the 900E or the 900F, to me is like a new project. It kind of follows the 800 series from the year before. It was kind of elevated with full array local dimming. And that was to be, well, think about this logically. They positioned the 900H as the more affordable gaming display. That's their thought process versus our thought process. Our thought process is... Sorry about that. Furnace kicked on downstairs. As I was saying with the 900H, it shows you that the engineers in Sony kind of think of gamers as an afterthought. Let's give them a cheaper option. Here's the HDMI 2.1. It'll be our gaming display. There's nothing wrong with the 900H. It's an excellent display, but it is under the 950H, the A8H, the A9S, the Z8H, all these letters, they don't think that those of us that would spend a lot of money on a display would want it to be for gaming. I remember having the Samsung KS9800, which was their top of the line full array. And when I spoke to Samsung about some of the defects in game mode, they kind of had this incredulous, like, you're gaming on it? And you're like, yeah. Thinking that, I think, very wealthy people or people that are going to buy a Master Series OLED at 77 inches are going to just literally put it up on a wall and watch movies with it, but they're not going to game on it. So I think that is a little bit of the culture. I think Sony's culture is also film-based. What looks good in terms of movies, accuracy, is very important to them. Where LG, having the game modes and G-Sync and FreeSync and VRR and lower input lag is definitely a priority for them. Now, has it always been a priority for them, or is it due to the fact that other companies haven't made it a priority? Samsung has always had gaming as a priority themselves, and I do think Sony is more focused on film and more focused on accuracy and picture quality. Now, bringing that full circle, which should you purchase? Well, if picture quality and accuracy and you love the look of Sony, then I don't think you shouldn't purchase a Sony based on the lack of HDMI 2.1. Now, here's my thoughts on why. Is variable refresh rate important? Is G-Sync important? Well, obviously, if you have a PC or NVIDIA graphics card, G-Sync and FreeSync are important. Having variable refresh rate on, right now, the Xbox One X, not on the PS4, it will be there for the PS5 and the Xbox Series X. Is it important? I like the feature. Screen tearing hasn't been a huge problem in most console games that have a built-in V-Sync for the most part. I haven't seen screen tearing actually on this generation much at all except for Modern Warfare. So I never thought I personally needed it, and my thoughts on it is you should go with whichever one has the best picture quality. Now, going forward, it seems ridiculous not to include HDMI 2.1 as far as us purchasing them. We know in our minds that next year we're probably going to have HDMI 2.1. Do I think that the successor to the A9G was going to have HDMI 2.1? I don't think so. It was due to be out earlier, and I think it would basically just be a large A9S, to be honest, with some subtle improvements over last year's A9G. But my point is, I don't think they were targeting gamers that way. But for us as consumers, is it important? I think the new consoles, I've said this on many videos before, are going to target 4K 30 with ray tracing and then 4K 60 when they mature. You're going to have some games right out of the box that are going to be 4K 60, especially Xbox One X, which for me, Xbox One Series X, Xbox and Microsoft are a lot like LG. They're looking to bring PC gamers and console gamers into one. You're seeing that with Game Pass. You're seeing that with Microsoft and EA now being part of Game Pass. They want to target that market. Now, going back quickly, you got to think that PC gamers using TVs, I did it in 2016, and it was almost ridiculous. A lot of games didn't have the Xbox One controller. You had to go in and use XPadder. So I don't think the PC market was really targeting console gamers all that much using a TV. Obviously, the TV's advantage, full array, OLEDs, black levels, the input lag has dropped, the latency is down. They are a great choice, which is why the 48-inch CX and the 48-inch A9S are amazing. However, the A9S not having HDMI 2.1 is giving you guys pause. Is it important? It's better to be future-proofed if that's what you're worried about. If you're worried about next year, your display having HDMI 2.1 and it's going to bother you, yes, I would wait. But if you're somebody who loves Sony and they're here, and the A8H, which is also incredible, which I thought got a bad rap because it came out not as a Master Series. So has the Z8H not being a Master Series and having the Z9G before it. Some people are overlooking those displays. We saw the A8H, Shane and I, at Value Electronics in the shootout versus the CX, and in everyone's opinion, it edged out the CX by a little bit. Both displays were calibrated. But to not purchase it when the picture quality is so good and the shadow detail on an OLED because of HDMI 2.1 has to be up to the individual if gaming is what your priority is. If it's not your priority, meaning that you don't need variable refresh rate, you don't need the quickest response time, you're still going to be able to enjoy gaming at 4K 60, 4K 30 with ray tracing enabled on the next consoles. Now, will some of the Xbox One games do 120 4K? Yes, they will. I think some independent titles initially, some older games from this generation will be 4K 120. If you absolutely need that, then yes, it is a huge mistake by Sony to not have it. But is it something you're going to miss? If you're somebody who's only gamed on consoles at 900p in the last how many ever years with the PlayStation and the Xbox, you've pretty much been experiencing things at 900p 30 FPS. So I think you would be very happy with 60 FPS. My Sony 900E does not have FreeSync, does not have G-Sync. I've gamed on that forever and absolutely have loved it with no issues at all. I didn't notice that my screen was tearing much. I didn't care much. I knew that even in the next generation, that 900E was going to be able to show me ray tracing and 4K at 60, which, here's the real shame. All of you that have had 4K displays since 2015, well, probably 2016, 2015, you've had 4K 60 available to you. You just haven't had the consoles that can actually deliver it. Xbox One X has not really been able to bring you native 4K at 60. You've had dynamic resolution, you've had all kinds of tricks, different patterns of resolution, but you would have 4K 60 on a display that you're probably getting rid of. So for me, is it a big mistake? It is a huge mistake by Sony simply because of our perception. It's hard to recommend a more expensive Sony A9S when the CX is cheaper and has more functionality. It's just hard to recommend if you are a gamer. It's hard to recommend them. However, I will tell you that having the CX at 77 inches, it is gorgeous. I will tell you that mine, I am in the US, it's definitely compromised. We're doing a separate video on this. It's needing updates. It has raised blacks that my 55-inch CX didn't have. So right now, the variable refresh rate and auto low latency and all these things, to me, has been an Achilles heel. That will be dealt with in updates, as Brass Tacks, a buddy of mine who's also on YouTube in the UK, has like 4 updates that we don't have yet, or at least I don't have yet, that'll fix the picture quality on this. But my point is, the A9S is already refined. And I'll do a video on Gears of War 4 that shows the black level of the A9S versus the black level of the CX. And you'll be surprised at how the dithering and the breakup of the blacks doesn't happen on the A9S. So, I know I'm all over the place. But I honestly think that Sony's thought process with HDMI 2.1 was simply an afterthought. And here's why I think it really is. If I'm an engineer building that display, releasing it in February. That means way before that, we were designing it and putting it together in prototype stage. The consoles weren't even on the horizon yet. HDMI 2.1 wasn't available until these next group of GPUs. It's still not available on these consoles that we have here. That's my PlayStation 4 sounds like an F-15. I'm sure if we're looking at it from their standpoint, they're probably saying, well, HDMI 2.1, what for? Well, for gaming. Well, there's no game consoles that take advantage of that yet. And I'm sure someone said, well, we have the PS5 coming. And I'm sure someone said, yeah, 2 years from now. Now, it's not 2 years from now. It's actually, if you think about it, when they were planning it, it was probably a year and a half away. And they're probably saying, well, the cost to adding HDMI 2.1, which I think is a greater cost, which is why I think Samsung and others only have one HDMI 2.1 port, as well as the receivers. I think they look at it and say, well, tell me again why I want to put HDMI 2.1 on a display when the consoles aren't out yet. So let's go back to the 950H when they're designing that display, as well as the A8H and the A9S. I'm sure they're saying, but the consoles don't come out till November. Why would and here's the part where I don't think they think the way we do. Why would anyone buy a TV for a console? Why would you spend thousands of dollars for a console that's not out yet? So we totally do that. I spent quite a bit to get gaming, more so than films, on the CX. So my point is, the way corporations think versus how we think is very seldomly going to be in line. We are the vast minority. Even us gamers that really care about input lag and responses and things of that nature, we are still in the minority. It is a mistake. I think it hurt the A9G, even though the A9G in many ways is probably a better display, well, I'd say many ways, but in picture quality because it's calibrated. It was much more expensive. At one point, the 77-inch A9G was $2,000 more than the C9. And that's where the mistake lies. Do they care? I don't know. I don't think Samsung cares. They just kind of do what they want. But here's my fear. Let's just say that the promises of HDMI 2.1 updates to the 900H and the Z8H, what will that mean? Will that mean there'll be variable refresh rate? Will there be G-Sync? Will there be FreeSync? Will there be all these added features? I don't know. None of us know. I will know me personally, the reason I wanted the C9 over the A9G, the reason I purchased the CX over the Sony was based on two factors. One is I wanted something a bit different. I'm very familiar with Sony. I've had them for years. The other is variable refresh rate, better gaming features, better gaming performance. And for somebody like me who has a PC, will have the new graphics cards, to have something as fully equipped as the CX makes total sense. But that's not what many of you should be thinking as. I see it in the comments where someone will mention, I'm buying this for gaming. They'll get crushed in the comments. Don't buy that. It doesn't have this. Leave that person alone. That person wants the Sony because they want that image quality. And I'm telling you right now, I'm not afraid to say this, the difference between the A9S and the CX in its current state, the A9S looks much better. At least my CX, as I do have some elevated blacks. And I'll show you a video on that. But it all depends on what your usage is. But I promise, or at least I shouldn't say I promise, but I'm fairly certain that what I just said in regards to how Sony was thinking is how they were thinking. You're sitting there in that place with a white coat in Japan, designing it, talking about it, wherever their headquarters is located, and someone's talking about gaming. I'm sure that engineer is like, what? Oh, gaming? You mean like video games? I'm sure that's the thought process. I don't think it's more complicated than that. Do I think that they screwed it up or they did it maliciously to make... Some people believe they did it maliciously. They're going to sell more displays next year. If you have a 4K panel already that you're happy with, that has HDR, don't upgrade. Just feel it out. Wait to see how this console launch goes. It's already a disaster with the pre-orders. They already screwed that up. Wait and see what games have that capability. But even if every game they came out with had 4K 120, you'll still have the exact same image quality on the display that you already have. If you bought a Sony A8H, if you bought a 950H, you bought a 900, or any of the Sonys, you're covered. 930E, 940E, Z9D. So, yes, so I think it's a mistake. I do. However, I think that's why the mistake was made. I don't think it was on the forefront of their mind. And I do think gamers, people that game on these displays, even people I know that aren't into TVs are like, you really bought that for gaming? I think that's the reason. And it's probably as simple as that. I know this is a ridiculous video, but this is what I've talked about with you guys in the comments. Yes, a mistake. I just think it was more of an afterthought. I'm sure next year they will have them. And LG is definitely doing well with having it and being cheaper and selling more. For the longest time, the LG OLEDs were more expensive. But I will say with Sony, the elegance of these panels, the way they look, they are gorgeous. I will tell you that my 55-inch CX looked just as good as the A9S before it took the update. So again, according to my buddy Brass Tacks in the UK, he has the updates, and a lot of the problems that are here with elevated blacks have been fixed. So I'm hoping that happens, but that's my thought process on why Sony missed the boat on HDMI 2.1. Yes, again, it's a mistake, but I wouldn't let that keep you from buying the display that you really like. I want you to see. So my thing is this, in closing, the video's all over the map. All of my videos are. In closing, would I have gone with LG if Sony had HDMI 2.1? And the answer is probably yes. I am so familiar with the settings. I love the picture quality of the Sony, especially the game mode out of the box. Those of you that love game mode, or I should say love gaming outside of game mode, Sony's pixel response, even with their LEDs, is always superior. Not superior to anyone else, but they have very fast pixel response. You can game outside game mode if you want. That flexibility, I probably would have gone with an A9G or one of those. So I am proof that it is a mistake in some ways, but it doesn't matter to everybody. That's Brass Tacks calling me right now. Give me a shout out to Brass Tacks. Shout out to Shane from Spare Change. Shout out to Value Electronics, guys. Love you guys. That's my thoughts on why Sony didn't do it. I don't have anything other than a little bit of what Robert said, the engineer said. It was a matter of timing. And again, what would the timing, what would that mean for them? It would simply mean they were going to put out a HDMI 2.1 display when it was appropriate. Most likely meaning after the consoles launched. So the consoles are going to launch in November. Then you have the holidays, and then the new 900 whatever will be released in February again, which isn't that far away. And there's HDMI 2.1. So if I am a Sony engineer, I promise you, they're like, what's the big deal? And we're going to go all the way around to that shootout real quick with Shane at Spare Change. You can see that live stream on his channel. We talked to D Nice, who is the calibrator, professional calibrator, as well as Jonathan, who was there calibrating. Both of them, in their minds, gaming is an afterthought. Neither one of them game. They're both brilliant. They know what they're talking about as far as calibration. They've been around the industry for 30 years, whatever it is. Gaming is an afterthought. They're like, yeah, I guess it's a big deal. So you can only imagine if those calibrators feel that way. I'm sure that Sony engineers, not PlayStation engineers, but Sony engineers and designers of displays feel the same way. Sorry for the long video. It's all over the map. This is what I think on why Sony doesn't have HDMI 2.1. If it's a mistake, it's really up to you guys. I'll be putting out more content every day. Things have been crazy, but things are good. Love you guys. I'll see you in the comments. And thank you as always. Take care.